In this podcast episode, Ben Shapiro discusses the rapid and aggressive changes being implemented by the Trump administration, particularly in relation to government agencies and policies. The conversation highlights the administration's approach to dismantling and restructuring various federal entities, with a focus on the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and the Department of Education, as well as the broader implications of these actions on California's governance and infrastructure. The podcast opens with a discussion about President Trump's strategy of using a chainsaw approach to governance, which involves swiftly cutting through bureaucratic red tape and dismantling agencies that have become entrenched in leftist ideologies. Shapiro emphasizes that this approach is not merely about ideological opposition, but is also a practical response to the inefficiencies and corruption that have plagued these institutions. The conversation notes how Trump moves quickly to implement changes that previous administrations have only promised, such as the potential shuttering of the Department of Education and the restructuring of USAID. The discussion then shifts to USAID, which has been criticized for its mismanagement and for becoming a vehicle for leftist agendas. Shapiro points out that the agency has been involved in funding projects that do not align with American interests, and he expresses skepticism about the effectiveness of its programs. The podcast highlights how Elon Musk is brought in to help streamline and reform USAID, with the aim of eliminating waste and ensuring that taxpayer dollars are used effectively. Musk's involvement is framed as a necessary intervention to clean up the agency, which is described as beyond repair. Shapiro, who has personal experience with the devastating wildfires in California, shares his insights on the aftermath of these disasters. He describes the destruction in Malibu, where many homes are lost, and the bureaucratic challenges that residents face in rebuilding. The conversation underscores the irony of California's progressive leadership, which has historically supported stringent regulations that now hinder recovery efforts. Shapiro notes that many residents, particularly older individuals, may choose to leave California rather than navigate the complex and often frustrating rebuilding process. The podcast delves into the role of bureaucracy in California's recovery efforts, with Shapiro criticizing the slow and cumbersome processes that often accompany government intervention. He points out that the same officials who now call for expedited rebuilding efforts are responsible for creating the very regulations that have delayed progress. The discussion highlights the disconnect between the needs of the people affected by the fires and the bureaucratic red tape that governs recovery efforts. As the conversation progresses, Shapiro reflects on the shifting political landscape in California. He suggests that the wildfires and the subsequent government response could lead to a great awakening among residents who have previously supported progressive policies. He notes that individuals like Bill Maher, who have begun to question the effectiveness of government regulations, may represent a growing sentiment among Californians who are frustrated with the status quo. Shapiro argues that as more people experience the negative consequences of bureaucratic inefficiency, they may start to align with conservative viewpoints that prioritize personal responsibility and streamlined governance. The podcast also touches on the potential dismantling of the Department of Education, which has long been a target for conservative reformers. Shapiro emphasizes that the agency has become a significant source of funding for leftist initiatives and that its closure could lead to a more localized approach to education. He argues that education should be managed at the state and local levels rather than through a centralized federal agency, which often imposes one-size-fits-all solutions that do not account for regional differences.